I just want to put one other issue on the floor before I get another question or two, which is Ukraine. This administration, unlike the administration you worked in, decided to provide limited defense articles to Ukraine. Do you think that was a wise decision? And more broadly, do you see any scope for any sort of a deal on eastern Ukraine?
The answer is yes, I think it was a wise decision. But then again, I was pushing that for 2 years before we left. So, and the reason is I think the more you up the ante, the cost to Russia for their aggression. I mean, as you all know, and you know this better than anybody, you know, the one big lie going on about Ukraine back in the rest of Russia is that no Russian soldiers are engaged, they're not dying, no body bags are coming home, et cetera, because there's overwhelming opposition on the part of the body politic in Russia for engagement in Ukraine in a military sense. Do I think I think the Donbass has potential to be able to be solved, but it takes two things. One of those things is missing now, and that is I'm desperately concerned about the backsliding on the part of Kyiv in terms of corruption. They made, I mean, I'll give you one concrete example. I was, not but it just happened to be that was the assignment I got. I got all the good ones. So I got Ukraine. And I remember going over convincing our team, or others too, convincing us that we should be providing for loan guarantees. And I went over, I guess, the 12th, 13th time to Kyiv, and I was supposed to announce that there was another $1 billion loan guarantee. And I had gotten a commitment from Poroshenko and from Yatsenyuk that they would take action against the state prosecutor, and they didn't. So they said they were walking out to press conference. I said, no, I said, I'm not going to, we're not going to give you the $1 billion. They said, you have no authority. You're not the president. The president said. I said, call him. I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting the $1 billion. I said, you're not getting the $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here. And I think it was, what, 6 hours? I looked, I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Well, son of a bitch. Got fired. And they put in place someone who was solid at the time. Well, there's still, so they made some genuine, substantial changes institutionally and with people. But in one of the three institutions, there's now some backsliding.
The courts.
Yes, and they had made that commitment that they wouldn't do that. And so when we left, the first thing I spent a lot of time, as did Mike, because this was his territory as well, and people like Charlie Kupchan and Victoria. And anyway, there were a lot of good people we had working on this. We spent a lot of time with Vice President Pence because I was worried that they would make a mistake as there would be a sin of omission rather than commission, failing to do certain things or say certain things. And that was at the time when there was an alleged, or there was a grave concern among the foreign policy elite that maybe a deal was made to lift sanctions. Whether that was true or not, but that was the atmosphere right after the election. And so what happened was they did some good things, and they now, what's his name, the guy they have over there?
Kurt Volker.
Kurt Volker, solid guy. But Kurt, as the best of my knowledge, does not have the authority or the ability to go in and say, you don't straighten this up, you're out of here. Because look, it all gets down to a simple proposition. We spent so much time, as you know, because I went to you for advice. We spent so much time on the phone making sure that everyone from, at the time, Hollande to Renzi to wouldn't walk away. They wanted no part of these sanctions on Russia. It had an impact on them. It was basically, you got to do that. And thank God Merkel was strong enough at the time to reluctantly, she didn't like it either, to stand with us. But always worked in Kyiv is I said, look, it's a simple proposition. If, in fact, you do not continue to show progress in terms of corruption, we are not going to be able to hold the rest of Europe on these sanctions. And Russia is not going to roll across the inner line here and take over the rest of the country with their tanks. What they're going to do is they're going to take your economy down. You're going to be absolutely buried, and you're going to be done. And that's when it all goes to hell. But the best of my knowledge, even, and I have, it's a very difficult spot to be in now when foreign leaders call me. And they do, because I've never, ever, ever would say anything negative to a foreign leader, and I mean it sincerely, about a sitting president, no matter how fundamentally I disagree with them. And it is not my role to make foreign policy. But the questions across the board range from, what the hell's going on, Joe, to what advice do you have for me? And my advice always is I give them names of individuals in the administration who I think to be knowledgeable and committed, and I say, you should talk to so-and-so, you should. And what I do in every one of those times, I first call the vice president and tell him I received the call, tell him and ask him whether he has any objection to my returning the call, and then what is the administration's position, if any, they want me to communicate to that country. But the point is, there is no pressure that I'm aware of, correct me if I'm wrong, no pressure I'm aware of on the present leadership in Ukraine to hold them together to be able to continue what looked like was a real possibility of turning Minsk into something that was doable by being much tougher than Germany wanted us to be. But we were moving in that direction, but now it looks like the pressure's off, and it requires just day to day to day.
Can I just jump in? This may be my only chance, but just on
Actually, you're going to get something you didn't expect. You're going to get the last word.
Okay. Well, just on the Donbass, and I completely agree with everything the Vice President said, because I think that's actually the major issue right now, is helping Ukraine succeed. And if they don't succeed internally in terms of fighting corruption and establishing rule of law, then it's a lost cause. But on Donbass, I truly believe Putin's play here is to turn he would be happy with a negotiated resolution to the Donbass. But as long as the Donbass is turned into something akin to Republika Srpska in Bosnia. If he doesn't get that, we're going to see the low boil, we're going to see the fighting continue, and we're going to see, more importantly, the dirty money flowing into Kyiv to affect their politics. And they've got elections coming up in 2019.
Yeah, I was, just as you know, in Russia, one of the things that constantly came up was a refrain very much along those lines, that in order for Russia to leave, the one thing Putin could never countenance would be on Russian TV reprisals against ethnic Russians on the Ukrainian side. That would be politically put him in an extremely difficult situation. This is not to defend Russian policy, but to explain it. Michael,
by the way, I think there's a way we could have insisted that not happen with serious sanctions on our part against Ukraine if that occurred. I don't think that's real.
I want to thank you.
Take the last word, will you?
Hey, just
That was the last word.
I'm not going to live this down.
I want to thank you, Michael Carpenter. I want to thank Vice President for three things. I want to thank him for doing this article in Foreign Affairs. I want to thank him for being with us today. And I want to thank him for, 4.5 decades of extraordinary service to this country of ours. Well, good afternoon. I want to welcome one and all to today's Council on Foreign Relations meeting, which, among other things, is here to launch the January-February issue of Foreign Affairs magazine. And I really do urge you all to read it. Like all of our issues, it begins with a cluster. And there's a cluster of about a half dozen articles on a subject that doesn't really get the attention it deserves, which is how countries have either dealt with or failed to deal with the legacy of their own pasts. Something I know intimately from my time trying to negotiate in Northern Ireland, but this deals with countries like South Africa, but also the United States. given our own complicated legacy, as well as Russia, China, and others. I really urge people to look at it just one step beyond the normal foreign policy conversation, but it's an important one. The subject, though, today is another article in the magazine. I probably should introduce myself to people, everybody. My name is Richard Haas, by the way. I work here at the Council on Foreign Relations.
And I work for Richard.
And we're joined today by the gentleman on my right, Joe Biden, who, of course, served as the 47th Vice President of these United States, and who now leads the Penn Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement. And let me say something about this center, which is based here in our nation's capital. It'll officially open its doors February 8th. And the mission of the center is to develop and advance smart policy and influence the national debate about how America can continue to lead in this century. And it's, quote, founded on the principle that a democratic, open, secure, tolerant, and interconnected world benefits all Americans, close quote. Full disclosure, the former Vice President and I go back more than 4 decades. He was a newly minted senator. I was a wet behind the ears young staffer on the Senate side of the Hill. And over the last 40 plus years, we've had a continuing conversation about the world and our country's place in it. And the only thing I'd put as a caveat is I'm not sure we distributed the time equally in that conversation.
This may be the only audience who will think it was you.
Never go up against a pro. That's what should have known. Sitting to Vice President's right is Michael Carpenter, your left. He's going to be, or is the Senior Director at the Penn Biden Center, and he's the former DAS, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia, and the two of them are co-authors of the recent article in the same issue, How to Stand Up to the Kremlin, Defending Democracy Against Its Enemies. Let me just say that their piece addresses many of the same issues as a just published special report by our own Bob Blackwell and Phil Gordon on how to respond to Russia's intervention in the 2016 presidential election, and more broadly, how to respond to the geopolitical challenge that Russia poses to U.S. interests around the world. And let me say, I returned from Moscow a few days ago, and I was struck by how limited this relationship is, our bilateral relationship. It's actually less to it right now substantively than it was during most of the 4 decades of Cold War. I'm struck, too, by how different our views of the world are, but also, and it comes out in their article, by the case for at least exploring the possibility of limited cooperation in meeting the challenges posed, say, by North Korea's nuclear missile program, or in trying to reduce conflict in eastern Ukraine or in Syria. But with that, let me thank both of you for being with us today. Thank you for writing for our magazine. And let's start. And again, I'll ask questions for a few minutes, then we'll open it up to you, our members. So let me start with the basic question, the scene setter. Is it accurate or useful, either or both, to describe where we are with Russia as a second or new Cold War?
I think that'd be a little bit of an exaggeration. I think, look, the Cold War was based on the conflict of two profoundly different ideological notions of how the world should function. This is just basically about a kleptocracy protecting itself. That's a vast oversimplification, but I think that this is about the Kremlin, and i.e. Putin in particular, doing everything he can to dismantle the few structures that were in fact set up in Russia that were trending toward, or at least squinting toward, as a famous founder of ours once said, squinting toward democracy. And there's an overwhelming, I think a basic judgment has been reached that in order for Russia, with all its profound structural difficulties that it has, to be able to sustain itself and for this kleptocracy to continue, there's much easier if you're dealing with 28 different nations, not in union with one another, not a Western economy that is coordinated, and it gives them more room to wander and engage in the activities that they've engaged in, which is essentially when the wall came down, everything that was part owned by, quote, the Soviet government was now owned by apparatchiks personally. So I'm vastly oversimplifying, but I think there's a basic decision that they cannot compete against a unified West, and I think that is Putin's judgment, and so everything he can do to dismantle the post-World War II liberal world order, including NATO and the EU, I think is viewed as in their immediate self-interest.
Michael, let me ask you a variant to the same question, and it picks up on what the Vice President just ended with. If you had to describe in an elevator what you think the essence of Russian national security strategy is, how they would define success for themselves, what do you think it would be?
So I think Russia has three principal goals. One is to weaken Western democracies internally. Another one, as the Vice President said, is to divide the countries of NATO and the EU internally, to deal individually with those nations as opposed to with a united front. And then third is to undermine the rules-based international order, which from Moscow's perspective is slanted in favor of the United States because it promotes norms of democracy, because it promotes certain other norms in the international sphere, territorial integrity, sovereignty, that Russia sometimes feels it can transgress when it wants to. And so what Russia has essentially done is it's taken the fight from what was originally just contained to the post-Soviet space and taken that fight now to Europe, to the United States, by subverting our institutions internally, by using sometimes hard power, but more often corruption, energy, information, and cyber to be able to undermine these democratic institutions, as I said, internally.
However, one might describe U.S.-Russian ties, they are not good. And looking backwards over the last quarter of a century, in some ways it's anticipating what history will grapple with. Was this inevitable? Was there something about the nature of America's definition of what world order consisted of, something about Russian political culture that essentially, despite the optimism 25 years ago when President Bush 41, my boss at the time, talked about a new world order, was it inevitable, or to some extent, does Western policy bear some of the responsibility for the current state of affairs? Obviously, high on the list of certain people would be NATO enlargement. Did we have to get to where we are, or could it have been avoided?
I think it's hard to say it could have been avoided, but it's more easily able to identify why it didn't happen. And it wasn't, in my view, because of the expansion of NATO. As you may remember, that was my primary responsibility on the floor of the Senate with Michael Hotzel. And the only time I had a real serious and elongated disagreement and debate with Pat Moynihan was on the expansion of NATO. And his argument was, it's vastly oversimplified, it was much more articulate than I'm about to state, but was that this is not the time to worry the new leadership in Russia that they're about to be surrounded and overtaken, et cetera. I don't see, I ask the reverse question all the time, is what happens if we didn't have NATO? Does anybody think if NATO did not exist, the expansion of NATO did not occur, that somehow the fact that a KGB thug ended up in control of that country would have been altered? I don't see any evidence to suggest that would be the case. As a matter of fact, I would argue that you would very much likely see more use of military power and force. And one of the things we talked about, and I will not go on any further, is that as all these Eastern and Central European countries were quote, freed, they all had their own agenda, their own historical fears, their own concerns, And they're all engaging independently in activities and actions that could have been very destabilizing to the whole region. So part of what we did was to stabilize and give some assurance to each of those countries that they should yield toward what would be more considered to be a basic democratic instincts and policies than to go the route some of them were considering going. And so I don't think that the expansion of NATO, history there'll be a debate that will continue, was the reason why the instability to the extent that it was inevitable that Russia would take the role that it took. But I do think there were a number of things when you think about it, as you've written about, and many of you have. There is.
I'm not going to mention the name of the book.
Well, you just made me forget the name of the book right then. But it's a very good book. I strongly urge you to buy 2 copies. But think about it. I mean, look at all the countries in the world, including in this hemisphere, that are coming out from under what has essentially been somewhere either decades, if not an entire history of corruption and dictatorships or oligarchs running those countries. And it's really, I've spent a lot of time. I mean, I've spent more time, I would argue, I've spent more time than any member of our administration trying to deal with making sure that this revolution of dignity does not blow up in the face of what is a great opportunity for Ukraine, but the corruption is so endemic and so deep and so consequential. It's really, 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 really hard to get it out of the system. So I think there was some, there was at least 100 years of history and beyond in Russia that made it difficult to actually set up these institutions in the first instance.
Michael, as you and just about everyone in this room knows, last month this administration published its first national security strategy. And among other things, it called for the United States to rethink the policies of the past 2 decades when it came to several countries, China and Russia. So let's focus on Russia, given our subject today. And it described those policies as being based on the assumption that engagement with Russia and its inclusion in international institutions and global governance would turn it into a benign actor and a trustworthy party. And the national security strategy goes on to say that this premise has turned out to be false. Do you agree with the national security strategy there?
So I don't think the premise that engagement with Russia is destined to fail, especially if one steps back and looks over the long run. Certainly, what we've seen is a increasingly revanchist and aggressive Russia acting out both on its periphery in Europe, here in the United States. Looking back, I think we can also see that there were some missed opportunities. But, the goal of integrating Russia into both international economic institutions, the WTO, the IMF and the World Bank, after the fall of the collapse of the Soviet Union, but then also more sort of norms-based institutions like the Council of Europe. I think that was the right choice to make then. Obviously, and going back to your question about was this inevitable, I mean, there was a certain sort of original sin there where the ex-KGB elite, as the Vice President alluded to, sort of captured the institutions of the state in Russia. And you can't get around that. And you saw that play out, prior to the last administration. You saw it in Georgia in 2008 with the cyber attack on Estonia in 2007. And yet, there were still sort of contingent events that shaped the flow of Russia's leadership and how it responded. And one of those, by the way, was the mass protests in Russian cities in the winter of 2011-2012, where all of a sudden you had the Putin regime, which seemed so stable, had been riding these high oil prices for years, starting to look fragile. I mean, there was one event where Putin shows up at a mixed martial arts competition amongst a crowd that's basically his base, and they're jeering and booing him. And so that had a profound impact, followed up as it was on the Arab Spring, in terms of internal